Yeah, we're basically going to start out by saying I put up my Patreon in the info, and with this live stream, we're going to go over on the idea of can Trump actually veto the act of Congress to suspend support of the Saudi war in Yemen. Now, this is a very interesting topic because when we start to look at what the way they did it is, it's actually kind of interesting because one of the points with it is it was expected that they were going to use the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973. But if you actually look at the bill, this is something that's very interesting about this. This never came up. Now, since this never came up, this means this is not what they're trying to do. And that was never the point, which means essentially that while this could essentially immediately stop it, Trump could essentially go back through and get appropriations, still get the idea of trying to ask for appropriations, and since he still got it, they could essentially still continue up until the time they have appropriations at this point. Or he can actually go and validate the point of saying, well, we're not actually directly involved in it because we're only providing these points here, and we're providing gasoline, we're providing intelligence, and we're providing the materials to do so. We're not actually directly involved in it, so he could probably try to bring that through the court system, and the court system traditionally is showing executive deference in that case, and he might be able to win that out. Now we look at the idea of it and the next part, and we get to the point of appropriations. They're not doing that either. They might be doing that at a later time to actually put a rider in the actual budget to actually state that no part of the appropriations can be used to aid the Yemeni war to any degree, and with exception of fighting Al-Qaeda, which would be essentially fighting against the Saudi side. And this would essentially be a case of where we see the that could happen at a later date, but this has not happened to this point. Now, this is still leaving the thing open. Now, what it basically states in this bill is merely that Congress states basically that it is Congress's authority and only Congress's authority to declare war or enter into any acts of war. Now, this is what we're talking about, very different. And when we're talking about this is something that is merely them reiterating their actual powers that are actually in the Constitution. And when we talk about this is a president couldn't necessarily veto the Constitution. Basically, if Congress were to essentially rewrite the exact point of pass and rewrite, and basically reiterate the whole point of, let's say, the Fourth Amendment, he theoretically could not veto this on that basis because that's essentially a statute that already exists. And this is the whole point. This is a statute that already exists, and all they're doing is reiterating it to this point here and using it as an application to a specific point. And that's where we might get to an actual court system with this, because he theoretically could not have this veto because, and this would lead to, if he tried to, this would lead to Congress having standing in the courts to sue over any to sue the executive over any veto, because we can see plainly in the actual documents that the executive has usurped authority over Congress. And you can see that in plain paper. And what they could do is they could say, we actually had something stolen from us, and this would essentially be one of the congressional rights. And you can actually see that within the actual our country's rule book known as the United States Constitution. Now, when you start to go after the United States Constitution, you're going to find out when we go to the National Archives, you can see under Article 1, Section 8. When we start to get there, you'll see that we get there and that's under number 11. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Now, this is very, very specific because that concerns all acts of war as well. Because you cannot commit an act of war or commit anything to an act of war, which means even aiding in it, which is still an act of war, without the actual without congressional authority. Now, since we know we know this as an actual power. We know that that the executive does not have this. When we start to go out to Section 2, we know that there is no actual, Article 2, I should say. Article 2, we see that there is no case that, even though it says him as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, and of the militia in several states, it does not call him as actually basically having the ability to do this, because he still has to, because they wanted separation of power. To do this, he needed to basically have the ability to basically, any act of war needed to be concurred with Congress. And that's basically where it says to declare war. Well, nothing has ever been done, and that means we've never declared war on Yemen. And since we're actually involved in this essential things was basically states that only Congress has the ability to do so, and it just reiterates Section 8 of the Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and states that only the legislature can do so, and that Article 2 does not have any such ability does not have any such ability to show that, even though he might be able to be, even though it shows that he is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States and the militia in several states, when called into actual service in the United States, it basically shows that he does not have access to do so until they grant him access. They're essentially on standby until they actually declare war or any of these points. Until they declare war or declare that that you can commit this act of war, which is declaring war itself. Until you do so, until you've got the declaration and the authorization from Congress, you cannot do so. And that's why when they did this creates a very, very interesting thing, because we have an actual document which proves it. And when we get to and we get from the idea of on Federalist Papers 47, we get that's where we get the idea of from Madison we get the that's where we get the idea on the separation of powers, because he understood that the and any one specific group in one hand with it would basically become problematic and lead to a tyranny. So he wanted to basically pit their ambitions against each other, and this is why you separate them out and make sure that that you have no one person being able to do something, and such important things such as going to war on. When we look at that, you'll see the and then when we look at the idea of the declaration of war, we see that it was basically meant to be it was solely meant to exist where the president could not do so, because there was just going to be one person essentially having the right to declare, and they could do so at any time. And that was why specifically they established that. And that's why we have the separation of powers there. And Madison knew that basically you would have if you would put the actual into a group of a huge group of people and have them debate over it, there would be less likely to go to war over no reason, and over basically, in many of these cases, the reason of foreign influence. And we need to be realistic with this when it comes down to the current system. Is we've basically for a long time been under foreign influence in our country, because lobbyists have basically lobbied for the military contractors, and they want us to they know that the more that we look into these foreign influences and basically obey what they want us to and go to war over nothing, the military contractors make a lot of money. And since military contractors are kind of at the beck and call of what for the sales of what the government allows, it's basically a socialist system. So basically they have to listen to whatever they want, and this basically means that their stock goes up and down with war. So the more that they can project, the more money that they make. During times of peace, they don't make much money and their stocks plummet. This is just a fact of life, so they don't want this to happen. Times of peace are bad for them, so the best instance to actually get a time of war is for concentration of power into the executive. Now, this is not exactly constitutional. So what you want to do, you want to basically convince the courts that, oh, there's an imminent threat on U.S. interest. Well, you want to explain what U.S. interest means in a very, very vague manner, and this has become more and more vague. It's not exactly meaning an imminent attack on the United States or its territories. It actually means basically, oh, it means one of the allies now. Now it means one of our bases abroad, and meanwhile our base abroad shouldn't even be there, because the fact is that's what's creating these problems. And this is where we get to this point, and this is why when we see this thing here is when we see the Congress asserting its authority, it's doing no more than essentially stating that this is what the Constitution says, and we're abiding by the Constitution. That's merely what it's stating there. It's stating that there is no actual constitutional authority for the executive to go to war without a declaration, without any congressional declaration. Doesn't matter if we're aiding a country or not. It doesn't matter what the standard is. And this is where it goes down to, and they don't, and essentially, if he doesn't veto, he knows that essentially it clips the executive's wings. And that's what he doesn't want to necessarily do, and he knows it'll definitely, because we have UAE, we have Saudi Arabia and Israel, who does not want the executive's wings clipped on this. You know that that'll basically change the way we react. So if he doesn't veto, this essentially shuts down the way the executive reacts. Now, would it be constitutional for him not to veto it and back off? Yes, it would, but essentially that would create that problem. Then the next thing would be either A, they would essentially go to a legal obligation and say, we have standing, we're going to sue over this. That's a very good likelihood because they actually have standing in court, because they have actually had their powers usurped by the executive, and they're going to state, hey, the executive actually stole our power, and they don't, they essentially are going to state that he doesn't have any legal authority to do so, and he doesn't have any legal authority to essentially do a veto, because all Congress was doing was reiterating the point of what their actual congressional authority was. Now, when we look at the point of what it would be at the next point, it would be, if they decided not to do this, it would be to start putting riders on the appropriations bill, and this would essentially be next when it comes down to the budget. Now, this would basically be set at really starting to clip the wings of the Defense Department of saying, you know what, we're not going to fund anything for Saudi Arabia for this war, or UAE for this war at all. And the United States cannot do this at all. And if the United States violates this, this essentially is violating the budget, and then there will be a lawsuit to the executive. I don't think he wants to go that far with it, because essentially he's stealing appropriated money. And last time we had that, we had essentially we had some court battles with Obama over the ACA and stolen money from Fannie and Freddie, of investors' money, to basically support the ACA with its subsidies, by stealing investors' money from Fannie and Freddie, claiming that the government owned it, so it was just fine to steal the money of the investors of these products, even though a lot of these investors were just trying to save money for their college, kids' college funds, and that was mainly what it was for a lot of these cases, and they were having all these people's money stolen. And essentially, if the Trump administration does the same thing, this is what's going to happen: is we're going to see it being rebuked from the Supreme Court as well. And I think it's going to be even harder as well from this case. And because you're not going to have the advocates from the left that are going to say, oh, but it goes towards a good thing. You're going to lose all those advocates. In this case, you're not going to find that. Now, now they could go toward that end with it. It might be a little bit hard, but that'll be a long road to go through, and it'll be hard to deal with that. And that could be a couple years down the road for them to deal with that. And it could be well after that point, and many, many more lives lost. Now, the best option for them is to essentially block him through, essentially by standing up and blocking him through the courts and trying to clip his wings immediately as possible. Now, if they can clip his wings and clip the executive's wings from using basically some made-up executive authority to go to war over anything, this will basically change the way our foreign policy reacts. Now you're going to have people like Mike Pompeo, Gina Haspel, and Ambassador John Bolton screaming bloody murder when this happens. You're going to have people like Netanyahu screaming bloody murder. You're going to have the Saudis screaming bloody murder when this happens, because essentially all of their foreign policy is going to be completely clipped, and what's going to happen is their war efforts and their basic efforts to reshape the Middle East and basically slaughter people is going to be over, and the game's going to be up. And this is going to essentially their basically humanitarian crises that they cause and their looting of the region is going to be over, and they can't basically team up with terrorism anymore, and it's going to, because they're not going to have the funds to do so unless they want to take the funds out of their own pocket, and it's going to start wearing down very, very thin, because no longer can the executive start going to war over nothing. And it's going to, because essentially he's going to have to go to Congress every single time, and it's not going to work because the American people are so sick of war that they're going to have to make an actual legitimate case. And no congressional member is going to say, you know what, this is worth going to war for, even though the people in my district are going to basically put me on an actual pitchfork. And that's the whole thing that people need to realize, is that they're not going to allow for that. And people need to look at the whole situation. So if they actually they need to go to court over this, and this is going to be the smart thing. Go to court, make sure that what you do is you actually sue the executive, and you win. You should be able to win this. This should go really, really quick, within like a month, and this thing will be over, and the executive will not be able to do any of these things again, and it's going to really clip the wings of their interventionist policies. Now your neoconservatives are going to be screaming bloody murder. Your neoconservative think tanks are probably going to go nearly bust. Your military contractors are going to lose a lot of money here. And they're going to say, think about the American jobs, and they're going to be pulling all this other garbage out of there, and they're going to try to basically use these excuses, except the real thing is it's going to be better for peace globally. They're going to actually have to state their case with everything, and actually get Congress to vote on every single time they want to do something. And it's not going to work, because the fact is people are going to be very, very wary of going to war. And it will essentially blow up in their face. And this is why we have a constitution. And that's why, if you look earlier on, before they tried to essentially do this, Congress was very, very wary to go to war to begin with. You look at up until World War II, we did not have many wars. Then since World War II, we basically used excuses such as using excuses as like, oh, it's for the national interest, the common defense of the world, and the UN gives us authority, and they've used all these excuses. Meanwhile, they've never actually asked Congress for authority. The last congressional authority that we've actually gotten was actually in World War II. They have not gotten congressional authority since then, because the AUMF was not actually on Afghanistan. It was actually on a war on terror, and it was just basically to get a specific group of people and one guy. It was not actually to go on an actual country. It was not actually country specific, so it was not an actual war per se. The last actual declaration of war was, you're talking, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's the last time we've actually had someone actually go to Congress as an actual president and actually make the case. They don't do that. They basically say, we can actually do this for 30 days and reauthorize it for up to 90 days, and as long as we move it over to another country, we can do that and continue that. As long as we basically move over there, then we can go back to this original country, and then they keep jumping from country to country, and they know that they can continually do this, and they can make excuses saying, oh, that original authorization meant that we can go for war for around the whole globe, even though that authorization is basically 18 years old. And this is the whole point. This is why that they need to be reined in, and this thing needs to end, and they need to deauthorize that authorization and say this authorization is over. I mean, when we're talking about it, when we look at the Constitution, it says basically that appropriations should not last for more than 2 years. So I think we should apply the same thing. We could essentially say that that you could probably apply the same rules and say that basically that authorizations should not apply for any more than 2 years, because if they're not going to appropriate for more than 2 years, it should be assumed that that was not meant to actually be for war for more than 2 years. And that would be assumed because you're not going to appropriate for people to go to war for nothing. They're not going to basically say, we're going to send people to war and war for without any appropriations. So theoretically, we should assume that basically a war authorization should only be for 2 years. It should match the appropriation time. And this should be essentially what we assumed on the Constitution. And that's legitimate when we're looking at it. It should not be basically never ending. And that's what they want. They want never ending. They want to basically be able to go to over 190 countries and be able to use it for any purpose and declare anybody a terrorist. Because you have to understand with it, the actual people who are actually fighting for the Saudis is Al-Qaeda. The exact people that we're actually supplying is the actual people that the AUMF is supposed to be going against. So theoretically, we should actually be aiding the Houthis, but for some reason, because we listen to Saudi Arabia, we listen to UAE, we listen to Israel, we had this idea that Iran is this evil entity, and that if we actually aid their side and get rid of Al-Qaeda, that we'll be doing something wrong. We'll actually be getting rid of the actual side that we've actually had the AUMF on, which we should be concerned only on our own security. We should never be, if we're going to actually do this fight against Al-Qaeda. I mean, it makes perfect sense. This is why when we look at this, it should basically, if we're gonna stand on something, we should at least stand on what we initially did. And if we're gonna extend it out to Al-Qaeda and all their affiliates, we should be going after these groups that are affiliates with Al-Qaeda, which are Sunni groups, not Shia groups. Shia is against Al-Qaeda. So supplying basically Sunni radical groups to go after Shias is completely actually against the AUMF. So if we are supposed to go after the Sunni terrorist groups and their allies, essentially we should actually be bombing the Pentagon. Based on that logic. This is based on that logic. We should be bombing the Pentagon, we should be bombing Israel, we should be bombing Saudi Arabia, we should be bombing UAE and all of the allies to that. But the fact is they would never do that because they would actually be following that logic. They go, oh, no, we can't do that. But the fact is we're actually aiding those terrorists we were supposed to wipe out. And the fact is we would never, we don't want to actually go in the right direction. The point is to keep the terrorists going. If you get rid of the terrorists, then there's no boogeyman to fight, then the defense contractors don't get their money, then there's nothing else. Then basically the war is over. So what we have is we have allies that are willing to essentially aid them. I mean, you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, who were basically involved in 9/11. Their governments were. You had, so these are the actual countries that were actually involved in in the actual reason why we actually established the AUMF in the first place. So we're aiding them. And the third one is Israel, who actually said they would rather have ISIS than Iran. Now ISIS is really an offshoot of the initial group that we were actually trying to fight, Al Qaeda. So if we're talking about it, we have to examine that, and that means that they would rather have this terrorist group that we're actually fighting, and they would rather have them, which is a Sunni group as well, and they would rather have them than Iran. And that shows that basically we're talking about someone who aids more Sunni terrorism, which means we should not be advocating for any of those three countries. They should be considered definitely enemies of us. If we look at ones who should be considered friends, it should be anyone who actually wants to wipe those out. Anyone who wants to wipe ISIS out and anyone who wants to wipe Al Qaeda out. This would be Hezbollah, this would be Iran, this would be Syria. Those are the only ones who actually want to wipe those out, as well as Russia when Russia's in the region. That's the only ones who actually want to wipe those people out. Everyone else is either neutral or actually wants to advocate for them. That's what we need to view as within these people. And anytime Saudi Arabia says, "Oh, we want to modernize stuff," well, how come they actually have people on death row, women on death row, for actually wanting to have the right to actually go freely where they want and actually have the idea of free speech? They're on death row. And we don't have any people in our actual country, and Trump's not speaking up for it. So when it looks like this with it is Trump has just gotten horribly weak. He's listening to the neocons, and he's basically willing to basically say, okay, we're going to let John Bolton control all of my foreign matters. And we're going to let John Bolton, we're going to let Netanyahu, we're going to let Mohammed bin Salman basically control all of the foreign matters of our government. He's basically totally checked out. He's letting everyone else handle everything, and he's not even doing anything about this. So when he says he's signing a veto, if it says the name John Bolton on there, don't be the least bit surprised. And if he has to scratch it out and John Bolton has to kind of learn how to sign Donald Trump's name, you should be kind of figuring that one out. Now this, I'm probably just going to end it with it because I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow, so I'm not going to be able to do my morning podcast. I know this week's been kind of hectic, but that's basically what this week has been, because there's been some mix-ups with my trying to get the blood work that I needed to get done, because of the way getting the prescription to the place where I get my blood work at, and that was a lot of mix-ups there for the basically Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then when I was finally able to get it on Wednesday, I was able to go in and get that done. Then today I was able to get everything done pretty clean, but I had some business I had to take care of, so that's why I was a little bit brief on my morning podcast, or my morning live stream, I should say. And then tomorrow I'm not going to be able to do a morning live stream, but I will have the night live stream, and I will have my normal podcast during the midday or early evening. Haven't really decided what it's going to be in, because I'm kind of caught up on my topics right now, so we'll have to see what that kind of goes over, and we'll judge from there. And we'll probably figure out how we end up handling it from depending on what comes in for news topics or whatever comes up as any ideas. I'll probably judge on what I do for that, and that'll be my topic for the day. That's about it. Basically with this one, just like, subscribe, make sure you share us all the way around. Check out my Patreon page and try and donate a little bit if you can. If not, share it around to someone else you know who can. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.